Welcome to another deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack an incredibly fascinating piece of history using a single, highly detailed Wikipedia article covering the Entente Cordiale.
Yeah, the Entente Cordiale, it is quite the document.
It really is. We are going to dig into the text, extract the most crucial insights, and figure out how exactly this reshaped the world you and I live in today. Just imagine this for a second. You have a bitter, thousand-year-long rivalry with your neighbor.
A literal millennium of bad blood.
Right. We are talking about intermittent conflict stretching back through the predecessors of both your nations. Think Agincourt, Joan of Arc, Waterloo's centuries of basically trying to destroy each other. And then one day you sit down, sign a piece of paper, and suddenly change the entire course of global history.
It is an astounding pivot. And, we have to remember, this isn't just some dusty historical footnote.
No, definitely not.
When we look at the alliances that triggered World War I, the very alliances that shaped the borders and conflicts of the modern world, it all traces back to this exact moment. What we are looking at today is a masterclass in how shifting global powers, mutual fear, and highly practical compromises can override centuries of hostility.
Pragmatism over pride, basically.
Exactly. We're exploring how an ancient rivalry was shucked off, not out of sudden affection, but out of sheer pragmatic necessity.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand the magnitude of this agreement, we have to set the stage in the late 19th century.
We do. The geopolitical landscape before 1904 was completely different from the alliances we think of today.
Right. You had Britain enjoying this policy of splendid isolation. They were essentially sitting on their island, ruling the waves, ignoring continental Europe entirely.
Unless strict British interests were threatened, of course.
Right, exactly. On the other side of the English Channel, France was also incredibly isolated, but totally against their will. Our source mentions they were reeling from the Franco-Prussian War and dealing with the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. But for anyone who might not be totally brushed up on their 19th century European history, what exactly did that isolation look like for France?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can see exactly why this status quo was destined to crack. The Franco-Prussian War, which ended in 1871, was a massive, humiliating defeat for France.
They lost a lot of ground there.
They did. They lost territory, specifically Alsace-Lorraine, and they were desperate for security. Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor who essentially orchestrated that defeat, was a master chess player. He knew France might eventually seek revenge, so he deliberately penned them in diplomatically.
He boxed them into a corner.
Exactly. He built this complex web of alliances to ensure France couldn't find a strong European partner. So France was trapped in this enforced loneliness. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Britain's famous confidence was taking a real beating.
The Boer War, right.
Yes, the Second Boer War in South Africa. It was a messy, incredibly costly conflict that exposed glaring weaknesses in the British military. Plus, they were growing terrified of Germany's rapidly rising industrial and naval strength. Splendid isolation was very quickly starting to look like dangerous vulnerability.
Which brings us to a specific, highly dramatic moment mentioned in our source text, the Fashoda incident of 1898. The text hints that this was a boiling point where Britain and France almost went to outright war over the Sudan, but France ultimately backed down. What exactly happened in the mud of Fashoda?
Well, the scramble for Africa was in full swing, and both of these empires were trying to connect their colonial territories. Britain wanted a continuous line of control from Egypt down to South Africa. France wanted a continuous line from West Africa across to the Red Sea.
And those lines crossed.
They intersected at a tiny, obscure outpost on the Upper Nile called Fashoda. The French sent a small expeditionary force there, and the British sent a much larger one. They literally stared each other down.
Just waiting to see who would blink first.
Exactly. But the French government looked at the situation, realized their navy was vastly inferior to the British Royal Navy, and knew they couldn't win a wider war. So they swallowed their pride and ordered their troops to withdraw.
That had to be a massive diplomatic humiliation for the French public.
Oh, it was devastating. You would naturally assume that such a bitter humiliation would make France hate Britain even more, perhaps irreparably.
Yeah, that would be my guess.
But it actually had the exact opposite effect on the newly appointed French foreign minister, Théophile Delcasse. Fashoda was a wake-up call for him. It proved just how vulnerable France really was.
He realized they needed friends.
Yes, he realized that holding on to this ancient grudge with Britain was a luxury France could no longer afford, especially with the German threat looming in Western Europe. Delcasse decided that securing Britain's friendship was the only way to protect France against the German system of alliances.
It's wild to think a near war actually laid the groundwork for peace. But our source text notes that Britain didn't immediately run into France's arms. In fact, they came incredibly close to allying with Germany instead.
They really did.
Between 1898 and 1901, the British colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, initiated 3 whole rounds of British-German talks.
Britain was shopping for friends, and Germany seemed like a logical, perhaps even culturally closer, fit at the time. They explored joining the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy.
So why didn't that happen?
The British ultimately decided the terms were just too restrictive. They didn't want to be dragged into a war over Austria's problems in the Balkans, so they broke off negotiations with Berlin. Only after that door closed did they seriously revive the idea of an alliance with France.
Even after those talks with Germany fell apart, the text suggests Britain and France still needed a massive external shock to finally force them to the negotiating table.
The Russo-Japanese War.
Right. The immediate trigger was the Russo-Japanese War. How did a war in East Asia almost cause Britain and France to shoot at each other in Europe?
A classic example of the domino effect of alliances. By the early 1900s, France had finally managed to secure one major ally, Russia. This was the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894. Britain, meanwhile, had recently stepped out of its isolation to sign the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902.
Oh, wow. So they were tied to opposite sides.
Precisely. When tensions between Russia and Japan boiled over into outright war in 1904, both Paris and London panicked. They suddenly found themselves looking down the barrel of a global conflict. If Russia called on France and Japan called on Britain, these two nations were going to be dragged into a massive, devastating war on opposite sides simply because of their friends.
Talk about an emergency brake. To avoid destroying each other over a conflict thousands of miles away, they finally sat down to resolve their differences. Which brings us to the agreement itself.
The Entente Cordiale.
Yes, the name Entente Cordiale literally translates to cordial agreement or cordial understanding. The source points out a really fun origin for this term. It didn't just appear out of thin air in 1904, right?
No, it actually dates back to an 1843 letter written by the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Aberdeen, to his brother. He was just casually discussing relations and mentioned a cordial, good understanding between the two nations.
That is amazing.
That phrase was translated into French as Entente Cordiale and was even used by King Louis-Philippe I in the French Chamber of Peers that same year.
It's fascinating how a casual phrase in a letter between brothers became the title of a world-changing diplomatic shift. But the source makes it clear that the modern use of the term almost always denotes the specific 1904 agreement.
The one signed on April 8th.
Exactly. And the key players who actually signed the deal were French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse, the French Ambassador Paul Cambon, and the British Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne.
Those three men effectively ended 1,000 years of hostility. But we need to look closely at what they actually signed.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you hear Entente Cordiale, you might picture a grand, romantic peace treaty declaring eternal friendship and military brotherhood.
A lot of people do.
But reading through the text, that wasn't it at all. It was basically a massive global real estate swap.
It really was.
It was divided into 3 highly practical, very specific documents. Let's break down the sheer global scale of these colonial trades. The first document was the Declaration respecting Egypt and Morocco. The gist is that France agreed not to obstruct British actions in Egypt, and in return, Britain promised to let France preserve order in Morocco.
Right. They essentially agreed to stop stepping on each other's toes in North Africa. It also guaranteed free passage through the Suez Canal, forbidding fortifications on part of the Moroccan coast.
Just carving up influence.
Absolutely. But the truly cynical part of this first document was the secret annex.
Yes. The source mentions an annex dealing with the possibility of changed circumstances in the administration of either of those two countries. Basically, they were looking the local rulers in the eye while secretly drawing up plans for what to do when those local governments inevitably collapsed.
He was incredibly calculated. And then you have the second document, which dealt with territories in Newfoundland and parts of West and Central Africa.
The geographic spread here is just staggering.
It is. France gave up its historical territorial rights over the western coast of Newfoundland, a right stemming all the way back to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, that was known as the French Shore. They did, however, retain the right to fish the coast.
Wait, let me get this straight. France had territorial rights to part of Canada dating back centuries, and they traded that away. What did Britain give them in return for giving up the French shore?
Britain handed France the town of Yarbutenda, near the modern border of Senegal and the Gambia, and the Îles de Los, which is the group of islands off modern Guinea. They also threw in a provision that redefined the border between French and British possessions east of the River Niger, heavily favoring France in modern-day Niger and Nigeria.
It is just wild to think about them swapping towns in West Africa for fishing rights in Canada, like trading cards. How on earth did they justify this?
It is essential to view this through a critical historical lens. As the source material outlines, on the surface, they are resolving fishing disputes and adjusting borders. But fundamentally, this was two massive empires casually dividing up the globe, mapping out spheres of influence over millions of people, primarily to solve their own European anxieties.
We are definitely keeping a neutral stance on the politics of empire here, just reporting what the text says, but it is undeniably striking to read about.
It is a stark reality of that era's diplomacy.
And the third document went even further east, proving your point perfectly. It concerned Siam, modern-day Thailand, Madagascar, and the New Hebrides, which is modern Vanuatu.
Another massive leap across the map.
For Siam, they actually carved out proposed spheres of influence. They took the Chao Phraya River Basin and literally split it down the middle. The British recognized a proposed French sphere to the east, and the French recognized a proposed British influence to the west. They disclaimed any idea of officially annexing Siamese territory, but they were still drawing imaginary lines over a sovereign nation.
They were securing their imperial borders to ensure they didn't trip into a war with each other over a faraway river basin, especially when that looming threat of Germany was growing right in their own backyard.
Right. Keep the peace abroad to prepare for trouble at home.
Exactly. They also threw in an agreement where Britain withdrew its objection to a French tariff in Madagascar, and they sorted out jurisdiction in the New Hebrides. The sheer scale of what they were trading highlights how vast these two empires were at the time.
That brings up a specific, vivid image from the source text that captures the mood of the era perfectly. It's a famous cartoon published in Punch magazine.
Oh, that cartoon is a classic.
It shows the personification of Britain, John Bull, walking off arm in arm with Marianne, who represents France, wearing a tricolor dress. They are turning their backs entirely on the German Kaiser.
And he does not look happy.
No. The Kaiser is standing there, pretending not to care, but the text notes a brilliant, menacing detail. The tip of the scabbard of a cavalry saber is protruding from beneath the Kaiser's army overcoat.
Yeah.
It's this visual implication that Germany was not going to take this new friendship lying down.
What's fascinating here is understanding the true nature of what Britain and France had actually signed, and why that cartoon is so perceptive.
How so?
Well, the Entente was not a formal military alliance. It did not involve a promise of close military collaboration, and technically, it wasn't even officially directed against Germany.
That is so counterintuitive.
I know. To understand how tenuous it was, look at the internal minute written by Eyre Crowe, a British Foreign Office official, in early 1911. French press reports were complaining about the moribund state of the Entente compared to the strength of the Triple Alliance. Yeah. Crowe explicitly wrote that the Entente was, quote, nothing more than a frame of mind.
Hold on, nothing more than a frame of mind. They based the entire geopolitical stability of 20th century Europe on a vibe. That is terrifying.
It really was just a shared view of general policy. Crowe elaborated that this frame of mind might become so vague as to lose all content. He literally said that for ultimate emergencies, it might be found to have no substance at all. If push came to shove, there was no legal requirement for Britain to send a single soldier to help France.
So it was just a fragile threat.
A very fragile thread.
But ironically, our source shows that it was Germany who accidentally cemented this partnership and turned that fragile thread into a steel cable. Germany tried to test the Entente to see if they could upset or break it. This happened in 1905 with the Tangier incident, also known as the First Moroccan Crisis. What exactly was Germany's game plan there?
The Kaiser went to Tangier in Morocco and basically declared support for the Sultan of Morocco's independence. This was a direct challenge to the first document of the Entente Cordiale, where Britain had agreed to let France have a free hand in Morocco.
Calling their bluff.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Germany was trying to intimidate France and prove to Paris that Britain wouldn't actually stand by them when things got difficult. The goal was to drive a wedge between London and Paris.
But the plan completely backfired, didn't it?
Spectacularly. By trying to intimidate France, Germany proved exactly why France and Britain needed each other. Instead of breaking the Entente, the Moroccan crisis terrified both nations so much that it triggered actual secret military discussions between the French and British general staffs.
The exact thing Germany was afraid of.
Yes. It forged the Franco-British solidarity that was later confirmed at the Algeciras Conference in 1906 and reconfirmed again during the Second Moroccan Crisis in 1911. So an agreement that started out as just a cynical resolution of colonial borders and fishing rights evolved, under intense German pressure, into the hardened military bond that would eventually carry them into World War I.
That is incredible, a classic case of unintended consequences. And, we can actually see the echoes of this 1904 document in our world today. It still impacts culture and diplomacy. When we look at the source text section on modern commemorations, they are massive.
They treat it like a cornerstone of modern European history. For the 100th anniversary in 2004, there was a state visit to France by Queen Elizabeth II and a return visit to the UK by French President Jacques Chirac.
That is a big deal.
It is. And for the first time ever, British troops, including the Band of the Royal Marines and the Grenadier Guards, led the Bastille Day Parade in Paris, complete with the red arrows flying overhead. And the legacy continues. Even in April 2024, to commemorate the 120th anniversary, France's Garde Républicaine took part in the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace.
But the relationship still has its funny, petty moments, which makes it feel so authentically human. Our source notes a hilarious anecdote from 1998. A French politician named Florent Longuebat actually wrote a formal letter to British Prime Minister Tony Blair demanding that they change the name of London's Waterloo Station.
Because Waterloo was the battle that finally defeated Napoleon.
Exactly. Waterloo Station was the destination terminus for trains arriving from Paris via the Eurostar. Longuebat felt the name was a literal insult to French visitors stepping off the train in London. It's like, welcome to Britain, remember when we crushed your greatest emperor?
It perfectly illustrates that even with a cordial agreement, historical grudges die hard. Blair didn't change the name, of course, though in 2007 the Eurostar terminal did eventually move to St. Pancras International.
Probably for the best.
But beyond the parades and the station names, there is a very real, very positive modern legacy to this treaty. In 1995, British Prime Minister John Major and French President Jacques Chirac set up the Entente Cordiale Scholarships.
That's a great initiative.
This scheme provides private and foundation funding for British and French students to study for an academic year on the opposite side of the Channel. The goal is to foster mutual understanding between the leaders of tomorrow. It proves that this pragmatic agreement evolved into a lasting educational and cultural legacy.
So what does this all mean? If we step back and look at the deep dive we've just taken into this source material, we see a remarkable story. Two historical enemies, locked in almost 1,000 years of intermittent conflict, formally ended their strife.
And they didn't do it by hugging it out over shared ideals.
Not at all. They avoided a massive, immediate war by sitting down, looking at a map, and trading practical interests. They swapped a town in West Africa for fishing rights in Newfoundland. They drew lines through Siam. They formalized the borders of their empires so they wouldn't accidentally shoot each other while worrying about Germany.
And for you listening, I think it raises a fascinating question about how international relations actually function. We often assume that history turns on rigid, legally binding military contracts. But the Entente Cordiale wasn't an alliance. It was, as Eric Crow famously noted, just a frame of mind.
A powerful frame of mind.
Exactly. I encourage you to consider how sometimes a shared view of general policy, a mutual understanding born out of shared anxieties, can actually become more powerful than a formal treaty, especially when it is tested and pressured by an outside force.
That is such a great point, and it leads me to one final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. The Entente Cordiale successfully prevented a colonial war between Britain and France in 1904 by dividing up global territories. It solved the immediate crisis.
But at what cost?
Right. By officially ending Britain's isolation and carving up Europe and the world into two massive, increasingly unshakable teams, did they ultimately make the devastation of World War I inevitable. When they shook hands over Egypt and Morocco, were they truly securing long-term peace, or were they simply choosing their partners for the deadliest dance in human history? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines.